Evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Rates and Lanes podcast. I'm your host, Rico Muhammad. I will be joined here shortly by my co-host, Mr. Chuck Snow, and our special guest this evening, DAT analyst, Mr. Dean Croke, is joining us as well. So if you have questions about freight, anything about freight, whether you want to know, have questions on dry van, refrigerated, flatbed, now tonight is the night to try to get in and ask your question. If you want to, you can type it right down in the chat, or you can click on the link that I just dropped and you can join us via video, and we'll take your questions, and we will always welcome your participation into the show. If you are watching on YouTube or any of the other channels, Facebook, like, share, and subscribe on the video, especially on YouTube. If you could like, share, and subscribe on YouTube, we definitely would appreciate that. So with that being said, and without any further ado, let me welcome my co-host, Mr. Chuck Snow. Good evening, Chuck. How are you?
We're doing great. How are you, Rico?
Doing well, doing well. I'm excited for tonight's show. It's always very informative whenever we have Dean up and on board with
Was
us.
it ever?
Comes with the wealth of knowledge and with the full power of probably the most powerful load board in the industry, DAT. So with that being said, I don't want to waste or belabor the point. Let's welcome in our special guest, Mr. Dean Croke. Dean, how are you this evening?
Really good. Good to be with you guys. I was just thinking, been too long since we've caught up.
Yeah. And you're such a great guest, and you bring so much to our show and to our listeners that we should really have you on more regular. We really should,
Yeah, let's do that.
because your intel is better than anybody else's, and we have all sorts of economists and people like that. But what you say is always comes to fruition. What they say, well, 50% of the time it does.
You know, that's interesting, Chuck. I often wonder whether I've got it right, but I've always learned to trust my gut, and it's huge. But I've also been pretty good at my instinct. My instinct served me very well over my working career, and in the last couple of years during the pandemic, my instincts have been fairly right as it relates to carriers and what they're thinking and where the market's going and how freight's shifting. So instinct's very important. I'd encourage everybody to listen to that internal voice more often than they do at the moment, if they're not already.
Well, you know what? Truer words have never been spoken. And when you get that gut feeling, you need to listen to it, because by the time you reach a certain age, whether it's 21 or 25 or 30, and your gut is telling you to do something or not do it,
Right.
if your gut says, do this is a really good idea, and it's not an emotional decision, it's a logical decision, because there's a huge distinction between the two.
Yeah, you've got to take time out each day to listen to what's going on too. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they were talking about instinct and how you've got to be very deliberate about listening to it, because the internal voice is actually very powerful when you start to figure out what it's telling you. But you got to take time to listen to it. That's the key point.
That's right. I will share this with you, gentlemen, and our listeners as well. Probably the most fatal business mistake I ever made in my life was about 35 years ago, and I went to go see a piece of property with some business partners. And when I saw the property, my internal voice said, run as fast as you can. And I didn't. And I ended up buying this property in a syndicate. And unfortunately for me, I was the strongest one in the syndicate, and I ended up holding the bag. And that mistake took 17 years out of my life, because
Wow.
I had to wait 3 months after we purchased that property. It started going up in value every month, and after the third month, there was a real estate crash, and this thing, like, it crashed like the Hindenburg balloon. I'm not joking. And it took me 17 years until it went back up enough so I could sell it. So boys and girls who are listening out there, listen to an old guy. And when your instinct tells you to do something or not do something, listen to your gut.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So Dean, I got a couple of questions. I don't know if you have the information up and available for us that you might be able to share with us. But what are for everybody listening in, and I'm pretty sure that some folks want to know right now with everything that's going on, where are some hot spots throughout the United States where, as far as load to truck ratios, are in favor of the carrier? Where are some places where some people might be able to make some good money if they're out there working on the spot market?
Yeah, it's a great question, Rico. Capacity is pretty tight for dry vans in around Joliet and Chicago markets this week. They're the largest freight markets in the Midwest. Outbound loads. Now, I'll add the fuel surcharge in here. Last week they were 227 without fuel, 295, so almost $3 a mile out of Chicago and Joliet markets. Outbound loads. That's the average of all outbound loads. That's a pretty big market. They're sort of in the top 5 freight markets in the country. The reason why I think it's a good market to keep your eye on is you've got nearly all of the Class 1 railroads hubbed, a lot of their rail networks in Chicago and Joliet. Joliet's home to one of the biggest intermodal ramps in the country. A lot of freight comes in there from the West Coast. I'd keep an eye on it. I think it's a very solid market. Chicago, Atlanta's been very good. Rates are up about 30 cents a mile in the last 3 or 4 months. So it's been tightening, Chicago, Atlanta. Atlanta, again, is another big distribution market. So rates are pretty solid there too. A lot of smaller markets offer some opportunities, but they're the big markets I'd be watching in dry van. The general trend, Rico, is that rates are heading south, which is not good for carriers in the spot market. But if you're getting a decent chunk or all of the fuel surcharge, rates are kind of holding their own. I wouldn't be too if you're getting the fuel surcharge, rates are kind of flat in the last 5 to 6 weeks at about $2.45 a mile in van. That's including the fuel surcharge. That's important to remember. That's including the fuel surcharge, which is 68 cents a mile. If you're not getting the fuel surcharge, it's like $1.70, maybe $1.80 a mile. So, if you're not setting the rate, someone else is. And the fuel surcharge is about 68 cents a mile this week. So if you think about where fuel is, it's up 50 cents a mile in the last 3 weeks, 50.5 cents. So what that's meant is that, as the fuel surcharge goes up and rates kind of, dip down a bit, the net result is they've stayed flat in dry van. So Chicago is a good market to keep an eye on. The West Coast markets are pretty cool right now. Nothing much happening there. Yeah. In refrigerated, Stockton's always a pretty good market up near Sacramento and just outside of San Francisco. That's a good market to keep an eye on. The other market that I'd watch, inbound, you've got to be careful with your numbers. Inbound into Florida is pretty good at the moment for carriers out of Atlanta. Rates are at about $3.70 a mile. They've been generally, dropping since May, but they've started to go back up again because of Hurricane Ida. But you've got to be very careful because outbound volumes have been impacted. And so, I think some of those big markets for refrigerated carrier, obviously produce this time of the year is always worth watching. I think the markets that I would keep an eye on, we're about 3 weeks away from the big salad production facilities like Church Brothers Farms are about to pick up shop and literally move their salad production plant on 60 to 70 flatbed trailers, move it from Salinas to Yuma, Arizona, and set up shop there by about mid-November. Takes about 72 hours to move the entire lettuce production. So you'll see, refrigerated volumes will start to move from typical farm produce markets to lower latitudes. So Florida, even though their citrus crop's been devastated and truckload volumes are down about 80% compared to this time last year, you'll see a lot more volume come out of southern latitudes that are warmer. So that means Yuma, Arizona for leafy greens. Florida starts to come online. They're starting to plant strawberries now, good winter vegetables. The Florida produce market generally starts to pick up in the first few weeks of November and then peaks in May each year. So Florida kicks off the produce season. Problem you've got to watch there is that The damage from Hurricane Ian has been substantial. It's estimated at about $2 billion. To give you a sense of how that's impacted reefer carriers out of Florida northbound, normally you'd see about 700 loads per week northbound out of Florida of fruit and veg. This week it's about 150 to 200. So it's way down. So citrus crops been devastated. A lot of veggies have been, devastated. Right through to beef cattle and dairy cattle. So be careful of. Inbound rates are pretty good into Florida. You've got to be careful on the way back out.
Take your backhaul with you.
Yeah, exactly. I've quoted you numerous times on that one. Take your backhaul with you. I'd love that. And the other market, though, I think is fascinating is Houston. The Houston market is just substantial, both from a freight volume perspective, but there's been a disproportionate amount of imports heading into that market in recent times. We've seen volumes up there in the order of 28% year over year in terms of imports. On the break bulk side, I looked at some break bulk data this week, it's not your containerized freight. So this is what they call break bulk, right? So I'll assume everybody knows what that is, but the ports had about 26 to 30% more 20-foot container equivalents come in the last year as shippers have moved away from Los Angeles over to the Gulf Coast. But break bulk tonnage, steel, metals, cargo, forest products, machinery, turbines, increased to about 7.5 million tons in the first 7 months of this year. That's a 56% increase compared to September last year in stuff that flatbed haulers haul. Steel generally accounts for about 75% of Houston's break bulk volumes. Right. And a lot of that's got to do with the increased oil and gas production out in the Permian Basin. The number of drilling rigs are up about 48% in the last year. A lot of steel pipe, drill pipe, casing heading out into the Permian out of Houston. So, Rico, flatbed is particularly hot in Houston. It's one of our biggest spot markets for flatbed. It's got a lot to do with imports. But what you wouldn't have seen is the break bulk increase. And I think that's got a lot to do with the fact Houston has invested a lot of money. It's a 52-mile port in terms of that, that channel. A lot of ship-to-shore cranes. They've dredged the harbor. Not a difficult market to get in and out of from a traffic perspective, although Houston's its own entity. Once you get out of the metro area, you're kind of, you're off and running. So I think they're the sort of the markets that I'd be watching. A lot of carriers have been pretty, down on the flatbed market, but we're still seeing pretty good demand. I think the takeaway we've got from a demand perspective, and I'll quote Jason Miller from Professor Jason Miller from MSU. Manufacturing, think about manufacturing in the US contributes to about 58% of our ton miles in truckload. Right. So, manufacturing itself, it produces most of the freight. Manufacturing activity in the US is up almost 5% this September compared to last September. ATA truckload tonnage up 5.5% compared to last September. I just did the math quickly while we were coming on air. We are building the housing market has got a lot of attention in the last little while in terms of how bad it is. We are building 24,000 more homes in September, just gone, compared to September of 2019. So even though, we had this massive increase in housing activity and flatbed volume, in terms of lumber and things like that, we're still producing freight volumes equivalent to 2018, 2019 levels. Now, 2018 was a really good year for flatbed carriers. Well, everybody agrees with that. Rates, of course, are a bit higher. Yeah, right. So I think that my synopsis is that even though rates have come down, they've come down from incredible highs, and there's still operating costs, of course, are up probably in the order of 25 cents a mile. Diesel's a big part of that. Yes, it's hurting everybody. But the rates are still pretty good compared to what we'd normally expect for the third week of October, going back many, many, many years. I think that's important to keep that in perspective. So, but I do acknowledge that if you're not getting the fuel surcharge and you're not, negotiating strongly, this can be a very difficult freight market for you right now. But again, hey, we talked about this on the show, didn't we, last year, about that rainy day and putting money aside.
Exactly.
Nobody. Right.
We talked about the spot market. We said, boys and girls, don't be chasing that spot market because
right.
that will come. It's like going off a cliff, and that's where you are. And of course,
Yeah,
when you've got that truck somewhere where there is no freight, whether it's
right,
California or
right.
somewhere deep in West Texas, and there's no
Mm,
freight, then you
mm,
are getting $1.12 a mile or whatever the
right,
broker
right.
feels like paying you,
Yeah,
because there's 85 trucks in one load.
yeah. I think
Circling back around, Dean, what are the futures, or what are they anticipating as far as fuel costs is concerned? Because I was watching
mm,
a little bit earlier this week. I was watching CNBC, and they were doing a little bit of talking, and they was talking about all the different volatility and stuff that's going on
mm,
over in the Middle East and everything, with oil production, with them
yeah,
cutting back on oil, and of course we're still dealing with the Russia, the
yeah,
crisis with Russia and Ukraine.
yeah.
So and they were talking about the strategic reserves and all that stuff. So do you have anything on what they're anticipating on what that's going to do here over the next, I don't know, 3 to 6 months when it comes to
Yeah,
fuel pricing?
this is something everybody's got to watch. I'm sure you've asked the question because you're acutely aware of how much impact this could have. We're about to head into winter, and our diesel inventories here in New England are a third of what they would normally be. And nationally, we're down to 25 days of distillate supplies. We haven't been that low since 2008. So our inventories are low. It's maintenance season for refineries, right? So normally refineries go into maintenance mode. We've got fewer refineries than we did a decade ago, and we've got maintenance issues. So production obviously decreases this time of the year before we get into winter, but we've got demand at 2007 levels. So we've got supply at a low level back around '08. Demand is at about '07 levels, and we've got a crisis going on in Europe, and issues in the Middle East where they're cutting back on production. This is a very difficult situation for us all, and there's probably never been a more important time to manage costs than right now, and be incredibly selective about load selection, what lanes you run, what empty miles you haul. You factor in, as you've said, Rico, you've got to take your deadhead with you. You've got to be incredibly careful about load selection these days, and knowing your operating costs has probably never been more important. We've said on this show a number of times, make sure you've got that money put aside for the rainy day. But I think having January, February, March truck payments in the bank before Christmas this year is absolutely critical. That's a must do. You've got to find a way to do that if you haven't already, because I think the first quarter next year is going to be pretty tough. We don't know where diesel's going to go, but there's no end in sight to this diesel crisis that we've got, thrust upon us by the impact of the war in the Middle East. That's having a profound impact on world supplies. Got a lot of politics running around in the background, sort of manipulating supply and demand. But the thing that carriers have got to watch is that, as a consumer, I'm paying more for everything that I buy at the
Right.
supermarket. We're all paying more. I would just say to you, if you think every shipper is expecting to pay, begrudgingly, I think in a lot of cases, the fuel surcharge, which is 68 cents a mile. So if you're not getting the fuel surcharge in your rate per mile, then it's on you to figure out a way to get full, as much cost recovery as you can for the cost of fuel, because the fuel surcharge is there. But if you're in the spot market, of course, it's an all-in rate. And that's
Right.
why you've got to know what component fuel is. In my spreadsheet today, that that theoretical truck I've been running over the last year, diesel is today 82 cents a mile. This time a year ago, it was 57 cents a mile.
Wow.
So
Jeez.
my operating costs are 207 compared to $1.82 a year ago. Right. So my operating costs are up 25 cents a mile in a year. Most of that's fuel. Now I'm paying myself 61 cents a mile as a salary. I'm leasing the truck, so I'm a mid-range buy in terms of the spend on the truck.
Yep.
It's not an expensive truck. I haven't paid double, but my insurance costs are also 10 grand a year. So I'm not paying 30 grand as a
It's a good
new
deal.
entrant to the industry. Right? It's a great deal.
Yeah,
So
it's a
that's
great,
why,
great deal. I just renewed insurance.
yeah. So when I peg operating costs on 100,000 miles a year, 15,000 miles empty at 207, it's kind of about what a typical DAT long haul owner operator cost would be. Fleet costs are probably in the order of 10 to 15 cents per mile lower because they have better purchasing power and a lot of our input costs. But 207 a mile, like that's a chunk of change. And you can see why carriers have gone back to being leased on to larger fleets, because they're getting about that money to haul someone else's trailer as a 100% leased on owner operator. But if you're an independent contractor out there, I know what some guys are doing, right? They've been in it for years and they own their own truck. So they've got, low levels of debt. They can afford to be very selective. But for the guys that are new to this industry and this is their first freight cycle, this is a wild roller coaster ride, because we have just come out of a very long freight cycle. Carriers shouldn't think that this is normal. This was an extended freight cycle because of the pandemic, where we saw record high spot rates for the best part of a year. And a lot of carriers banked a lot of money over that period of time, and that's given them some runway into this year. That's why they've been able to absorb some of the higher operating costs. But that runway is coming to an end,
Well,
very
I'm not so
soon.
sure if they banked a lot of money. I'm hearing a lot on social media. I'm hearing a lot of people that are crying and complaining and belly aching about rates.
Because they didn't save any money, Rico. That's why they went out and they bought shiny wheels and they took holidays and did all sorts of other stupid stuff that people do when everybody was saying, guys, people have been in it a long time. We've seen these cycles, and this was our summer, boys. That's really expect winter. There's going to be some tough storms, and people don't want to listen. I think Dean's advice, I think, is so fantastic to have those, because those first 3 months, historically, we haven't seen this in a while, but historically, what I have found in 48 years, for 45 of them anyways, as soon as the American Thanksgiving on that Wednesday afternoon, around 12 noon, things start shutting down. And except in really, really strong freight years where the economy is just ripping it, what happens is you have that Wednesday afternoon, and that's when the big bird drops. When people bring home the turkeys, and it doesn't come back quite often till March. You're into the last week of November, you're into all December. The supply chains are full. And then you have the January Boxing Day sales, or whatever you call after, post-Christmas sales. February is not great. By the time March comes, spring hopeful, because people are starting to get ready to put gardens in or thinking about it. And they have to move all that garden furniture and fertilizer and all the other things, and to get ready for the next season. But I think your advice is just stellar.
Now, Chuck, there is opportunity out there. Like, so, you talked about Thanksgiving. So 3 weeks out from Thanksgiving, turkeys start moving, fresh turkeys start moving in huge volumes out of the Midwest. So, that meat patch is going to offer pretty lucrative rates for refrigerated carriers. Of course, you've got to get there without too many empty miles. But there's going to be a high demand for reefer carriers. Rico, you asked about hot markets. I forgot about the Midwest, Joplin, all those markets there where you see a lot of those, the meat patch, right? You're going to see pretty good rates coming out of there for refrigerated carriers with fresh turkeys. So you will see some seasonal lift in spot rates heading into Thanksgiving. Of course, the day after Thanksgiving is when all the Christmas trees have got to be in the parking lots. So you'll see a lot of flatbed volume, dry van volume, heading out of northern latitudes south. So they're already starting to do the Christmas tree ornamental designs right now for the wreaths. That's already starting. They're doing some exports of Christmas trees to Hawaii. That starts around now. They'll get into the the fresh cut trees. The busiest week is 2 weeks from Thanksgiving, believe it or not. The week before is pretty busy, but the 2 weeks before is when they really start to shift a lot of volume. So watch those markets around Portland, Washington, of course, Maine, Vermont, Quebec. All of those markets will produce a lot of, and it's typically backhaul volume of trees. If you can handle the sap, it's a nasty thing to have in your van if you end up hauling those things. So there's some opportunity there.
So actually, I get the message is right now. I mean, there's still a little bit of time for everybody that's listening in. Get lean. Get as
Yeah.
lean as you
Yes.
possibly can, and start
Oh.
and start making sure that you are not
Yeah.
over going into excess and things that you're not necessary, that's not absolutely necessary for your operation.
Yeah.
Have I don't know if you have this number, Dean, or not, but has the amount of new entrants kind of slowed down as far as people coming
Oh,
into the
man.
industry, or
No.
doing
They are blowing the wheels off it. It's absolutely
Really?
nuts. It's nuts. I studied the FMCSA data for new DOT authorizations for the last 2 or 3 years. We have added at about the rate of 10,000 new companies a month
Holy.
for all of this year. And I'm puzzled as to what a new DOT entrant would see in this market. And I have a couple of theories that we can expand on, but we've been adding about 26 to 30,000 new power units per month for the best part of this year. Now, it slowed down early in the year. The peak was really December, the last quarter of last year. We saw an incredible influx of carriers last year. And I think that leads to the answer to why we're seeing so many new carriers. Remember back this time last year, we were seeing a lot of port disruption.
Right.
We were worried about things being on supermarket shelves. Did we have Christmas presents for kids? Everybody was panicking. A lot of spot market LTL freight was moving on hot shots, box trucks, straight trucks. And I think what's happened, and again, I can't prove this with data because no one really captures the class 2, 3, 4 truck market, only the 5, 6, 7, 8, but the dualies, the hot shots, the box trucks, the straight trucks, the guys that don't need a CDL, that don't need, drug screening.
Right.
I think a lot of the new DOT entrants that have entered the market, there has been a disproportionate number of smaller truck operators enter the market. The LTL market's been sustained pretty much for the last 18 months. Those volumes are slowing a little bit, but according to people in the industry, those volumes have been pretty consistent. And I think it's a hangover from last year when shippers said, heck, we need to move whatever we can on whatever we can.
Right.
Whenever we can, and then a lot of that meant, a 5.6 liter diesel pickup, dually, gooseneck trailer, and we've got 3 pallets, 6 kids, and 4 truck axles on frames, and off we go. And we talked to one of our good friends of our DAT show is the CEO of Canada Expedite, Nicole Glenn, one of the experts in the industry in the LTL freight, and she said on our show that a lot of shippers have preferred that LTL model to the traditional LTL model of a hub and spoke, where you've got a lot of damages because you've got multiple handling points. So a rate per mile on a hot shot. I just think that's what has been the driver of a lot of activity is the smaller consignment, shorter length of haul, because we've moved this whole freight task closer to populations. That's my theory. I've got to figure it out through data if that is in fact the case. But it kind of makes no sense that we've been adding more capacity throughout this year when we're talking about rates decreasing. But I think when we talk about DOT numbers, that includes everything from a box truck to a straight truck to a Peterbilt. So you can't look at DOT numbers or the FMCSA to be precise and say that's all truckload capacity. It's not. I think truckload capacity is probably flat at best. And I think you're seeing more trucks coming out of factories now, and the large fleets are turning over some of those higher mileage trucks. They've been running longer, which means they'll flood the used truck market, and used truck prices will come down as inventory builds for second-hand used truck buyers coming into the new year. So that's sort of where I see things right now. But the fact that we've been adding so much capacity has sort of been a perplexing point for the most of this year. Certainly not in the truckload space. I don't think we've been adding near as much capacity as people would like to make out.
I think a lot of this, a lot of the activity has just been transferred. And I think that where some of the companies, and I'm just going to say out names, I don't know for sure, but where companies like Werner or Schneider or any Knight, where they've had issues trying to hire drivers, they sell trucks that have 500,000 or 600,000 miles on them. They sell them to independent guys, and they get those guys to pull their trailers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's gone on a fair bit, so I understand.
Yeah. The math works out that in about May, Chuck, the math worked back in their favor.
Right.
So, and I'll take you through the math, right? So if you want to run your own authority, you need about 50 cents a mile for your own authority, your own trailer, your own
Right.
insurance, all of the other stuff that goes with it. It's about 50 cents a mile. Well, for the best part of pre-pandemic years, it was about $1.50, maybe $1.60 a mile you were getting to be leased on. So that means spot
Right.
rates needed to be around $2 a mile.
Yeah.
The line haul spot rates needed to be $2 a mile before it was worthwhile to run your own authority. And of course, we were there at $2 a mile in about September 2020. And we
Right.
were above that. We were about $1 a mile above that break-even level for about 15 to 16 months. So that's why you saw so many carriers get their authority and buy a trailer, lease a trailer, and just get in the hammer lane and go and make as much money as they could, and
Yeah.
they did. But of course, come May, when diesel costs went up and rates dropped, when we came back through May, we dropped below the break-even point. Now,
Right.
even though leased on costs, leased on rates for owner-operators had gone up from $1.50 before the pandemic to about $1.75 in 2021 to about $2 a mile now as an average, right? We dropped below the break-even point in about May this year when spot rates came down, and that's why you saw so many carriers go back to being leased on. But a little bit of a nuance this year, guys, because I saw carriers that were, carriers that had seen a few market cycles were pretty cashed up, and they'd offloaded some equipment and made some money that way
Right.
because used truck prices were so high. But they'd had a little bit of runway in terms of equity, and they decided to park some trailers and not be as aggressive as they would normally be, and be more selective about their loads. So I think that's what we've seen. It's kind of an interesting time, but certainly a lot of owner operators have shifted back to being leased on with larger fleets. So the debate is always, have we seen a net increase or decrease in total capacity? I would always say that I think we've seen an increase in capacity, because who's buying those used trucks? Who has been buying those used trucks?
Small carriers.
Right. So small carriers coming into the business, because if
Right.
you were leased on to a large truckload carrier and then went out and got your own authority, you've still got a truck. You're not buying another truck.
Right.
So the narrative that a lot of people in the media put out saying, well, it's just owner operators, going from company drivers to leased on. Well, that's part of it. But
Right.
the narrative that said that guys that were leased on to a large truckload carrier just suddenly went out and got their own authority doesn't explain it either. Sure, there was some of that, but I know a lot of guys that have went out on their own, bought their own truck. They were company drivers, got their own truck, looking to buy 2 or 3. And to your point earlier on in the show, Chuck, a lot of them have been very clever in the last year and picked up some good contract freight,
Yeah.
and have got a good mix of spot and contract. And I think if you're clever about it, some of the DAT's top 50 lanes based on volume are about 30 cents a mile higher than the national average. So even though, there's the saying is in data science, there's no one home at the average, right?
Right.
The average is kind of a blended average of everything put together. But on the tail, there are some really good margins to be made for carriers that are selective about who they haul for and what lanes they run and when they run them, what day of the week, what time of day. And I think that's where we've seen some pretty good opportunity for carriers. But, to do that, you've got to really study the market. You've got to listen to every single podcast you can. You've got to read everything you can. Like I can't encourage truckers enough to understand the demand for what you haul, so that you know where to be and when, and how
Right.
hard to negotiate. That's absolutely
Exactly.
critical.
That's a key point, Dean. And I think that's why I was curious as to the amount of new carriers that are coming into the
Right.
marketplace, because one of the critical things that I had to deal with when I first came in, back in 2010, I came from being a company driver. I came from the aspect of thinking about miles equal money, and not necessarily understanding the difference between negotiating and how to negotiate,
Right.
and what lanes equal what rates, and what rates went with which lane, which is the birth of how we came about to try to do this podcast, to try to help people kind of
Right.
shorten that learning curve a little bit. And but you got so many people that most your average trucker, your average, because we're so the segmentation inside of the trucking industry is mostly a lot of us one truck Charlie guys.
Right.
It's a lot of mom and pop shops, and a lot of people are not necessarily sophisticated enough to understand the different nuances of negotiating. Because the only thing that, at the end of the day, salt of the earth, hardworking people, we just want to work, and we want to be able to be paid, compensated fairly for what we work, but not necessarily understanding the dog and pony show that goes into the negotiating of the rates. And and we just sometimes get so frustrated. We're bad negotiators, and we get so frustrated, and we end up driving a lot of times, unfortunately, if you don't know any better, we end up driving rates down a lot further than where they should be, because we don't know. We just don't know what we're doing.
Right.
And you know, Rico, that's a really good point, because, you know, we DAT cops a fair bit of criticism incorrectly, because a lot of folks would, you know, they look for someone else to blame for low rates. And I like to remind
mentality.
I like to remind people that DAT doesn't own any trucks, nor do we set the rates, because our rates on our load board are what brokers offer, right? That's an offer. It's a bid. It's like an auction. You've got to be a good negotiator to, you know, find the right rate for you. If you're not setting them, the broker is. And what I like to remind carriers is that our rates on our load board. So when I say that the average rate to haul a dry van, including fuel, is $2.45 a mile this week, that's based on loads that carriers have moved. These aren't based on load board rates that a broker throws up there. And a lot of folks have kind of had a cheap shot at us by saying, well, that's just the rates that the brokers have posted. No, it's not. Every night we get an upload from all of our rate contributors of all of the loads being moved. Half of them haven't been delivered when we get them at midnight tonight, but a lot of them have been delivered, and we're getting the rates that carriers have accepted to move those loads at. And unfortunately, Rico, as it was in Australia 40 years ago when I started, we are our own worst enemy, because somebody's hauling that cheap freight, and it's not DAT. You can blame us all you like.
You don't set any rates. You're
a
data. All you are is you're a load board with data. That's all. You don't. The biggest enemy that truckers have are themselves, because we are the guys that lowball the rates.
Right.
Well, the other thing that I would use too, you know, I would tell people is, back when I first got started and when I understood what the average rate was. Well, do you consider yourself average? Do you give average service? I don't deliver average service. I consider myself to be above average. So I'm always going to be the average rate is going to be like my very bottom dollar. I'm shooting way above that average. Understand what an average is, ladies and gentlemen. That's not the goal. You know what I'm saying? That's exactly what it is. It's the average. You have the high, and then you have the low, and then you got the average. I don't consider myself to be average, and you shouldn't consider yourself to be average. If you are delivering top-notch service, you know, charge for what, you know. There's an old joke that a farmer had an old farmhand came around, and he said, you know, well, what do you pay me? He said, well, I'll pay you exactly what you're worth. He said, well, I ain't gonna work for that. If you decide that you're not worth that much, then you know you don't have anyone else to be upset with but yourself.
Right. Yes. You know, you've got to be. I think you know, I've always prided myself on being an incredibly good driver, good mile maker. You know, I can do as good a mile as anybody. I break a lot of stuff along the way. Like, I'm terrible at that. I break so much stuff, but man, I can pump out the miles. Right. But what I've also done is along the way is studied the business I'm in. I made a point to be a good businessman, and I studied the business of being in business, not just a truck driver. And I think that's where a lot of carriers need to spend a lot more time. That's on the business side of it. You know, not on social media. You're not going to learn this on social media necessarily. You're going to learn it on shows like this, but you're going to learn it by studying and learning, you know, listening to people outside of the industry, I think, on how to run a smart business. And that's where I think you can pick up some good ideas. I think far too many of us take too much information from social media. You know, misery loves company. And I think a lot of guys get on social media and they talk the industry down. Heck, you've only got to be listening to us for the last year, and you would have known this rainy day was coming. And I think that's where a lot of folks, you know, trying to don't take all of the information in, and they have a very narrow selection of information sources. And that's the biggest detriment, I think, that a lot of carriers face. I'm speaking at a couple of conferences, Truck and Hustle with Ramel Watley coming up in Dallas, Women in Trucking. I'm doing a keynote session, all owner operators. And that's kind of my message to a lot of these young folks that are in the industry. You've got to be more in tune with the business side of the business than strapping and chaining and tying down loads. Because the big picture, that's the easy part.
Yeah, it is.
We got a guest. We got a guest that wants to jump up on board with us. We want to welcome our guest in. Good evening. What's your name, sir?
Airborne trucker. Airborne
He
trucker. He's probably he's an air freight specialist sitting at the airport, ready to haul. Is that what's going on there?
Do you got any audio? Say something.
Hello.
No, we don't have any audio on you. Maybe type it down in the chat box. We don't have any audio on you. We'd love to get you up and on board, but we got to have some audio. But negotiating is a key thing, and like you just said, podcast is one way of getting those, trying to get yourself brushed up on those skills. But like I've always said, time and time again, ladies and gentlemen, Audible is your friend. You're using a lot of time driving a truck, and instead of listening to a lot of sometimes you can use that to your advantage and go find. There are really great negotiating books out there that are available. There are master classes that are being given on negotiating and things of that nature. Different nuances, but don't, like they always say, don't start the negotiation or begin a negotiation with, is that the best you can do? Of course that's the best they can do. You have to learn how to also, in a short period of time, look for different things, different nuances that you might be able to utilize to your advantage. Try to make sure that you try to be friendly. A lot of times that's why I better keep that to myself. I don't want to come across as sounding
no, go ahead, Rico. Let it go.
Or anything like that.
Let it fly, buddy.
But I mean, when they have the female dispatchers and stuff, that sweet little voice that you hear a lot of times, because they know this is a male-dominated industry. A lot of times, we some suckers for a nice sounding lady.
You know what? Because that's the right way. Like, seriously, when you look at who gets into the trucking business for the most part, it's either mechanics or truck drivers. That's who gets into it. The ones that are started by salespeople, the trucking companies started by salespeople, historically do very well, a lot quicker, because they know that part and they can buy the expertise or learn the expertise about running the trucks, which is important. And you need to know how to operate them and how to maintain them. That's all part of it. But you do
think like a customer.
You have to understand the business side of it. It's great. Knowing how to drive a truck is very important. Knowing how to fix a truck is very important. But knowing how to run a business is a whole other skill set that people need to have.
And we've covered this on the show a number of times, right? And that's, understand the demand for what you haul. If you're a low bed machinery guy, understand what imports are in Baltimore. You've got to understand why does it peak in March each year? Well, that's an easy one, right? Because it's harvest season is coming up and everyone's got to get all the machinery out to the Midwest. Right. That's kind of a layup, but it's an example. Study the produce season, read all the data from the USDA, understand that the produce season is going to be delayed this year because of the damage of Hurricane Ian. Strawberries and blueberries come online in January, there's a good chance that could be delayed. So understanding those sorts of things help you figure out where to position your trucks. We talked about Thanksgiving turkeys, fresh turkeys. We talked, there's a lot of capacity, a lot of port volume coming in around Philadelphia right now from Chile, Guatemala, a lot of, plantains, a lot of bananas come into Houston, into Galveston area. There's a big Dole plant there. But right now you're seeing a shift in produce from farms to ports. is sort of, that's a high level generalization, but you're seeing a lot more imports over winter come in from southern latitudes because because the citrus crop has been devastated in Florida. You're going to see a lot more citrus come into the Port of Los Angeles, San Diego, and Philadelphia from South Africa and Australia.
Yep.
So they've got to pick up the slack. And so what does that mean for carrier? If you're listening to the news around what's happening in the produce market, it tells you about where to position your trucks, like where you think the rates might be. Give yourself the best chance at the best rate. And that's why you've got to understand the demand for what you haul. You've got to spend more time on the business of being in business than being a trucker. That's the easy part, folks. And I know it's hard. It's really hard when you're tired and grumpy and you're away from home and you're in a terrible truck stop. I know that's as hard as it gets, but you've got to find a way to be more than just a trucker or an owner operator. You've got to be a small business person mentality that happens to move things that other people need.
But if we've said it once, we've said it 1,000 times, especially on this show. Anybody that's one truck, anywhere from 1 to 4. Maybe if you got 5, you can maybe do a little bit more. 5 or more, you can maybe change this up a little bit. But I think from 1 to 4, you have no business running the entire United States.
No. You don't even with Rico. I don't like to contradict you, but I think you need a lot more trucks than that.
Well,
I think if you want to be a 48 state carrier, you better have 25 trucks. Anything under that, I think you need to be a regional. It doesn't matter. You could be from New York to California, New York. That's fine if that is your lane, but that's got to be your lane. That's how you build your business. It's just too hard to build a business otherwise. And the other thing, and you touched on a little bit earlier, Rico, I think it's really important for anybody in business, and especially truckers. Truckers have all this time. We have satellite radio now. It's probably the best invention since the diesel engine. There's not just the trucker channel, because some of that stuff is pretty non-trucker.
Yeah, but they got important business school on there.
Yes, they got CNBC and all sorts of great business shows on. When I was driving truck many years ago, when I started driving truck, we didn't have any of this. And if you did get a little bit of a business show, it was on an AM radio. And after 12 or 15 miles, you were out of range. You couldn't get it. And you had an 8-track tape player. Like, things have changed. We've got podcasts we can listen to. All this wonderful there's more information that you could ever digest, and it's available at your fingertips after you have chained and tarped your load.
There's no excuse.
Before we get out of here, I'm gonna try to get Airborne Trucker back in. Let's see if he got.
Oh, there he is.
Do you got your audio fixed?
Oh,
no,
I can't lip read either. I'm gonna try and lip read. I can't lip read.
No, we don't. I'm sorry, Airborne Trucker. We don't have any audio on you.
Is he muted on your end?
When you click in, try to make sure you allow your microphone to turn on.
Oh, he's gone again.
Yeah, he needs a hot mic.
Well, you know what? It doesn't look like he's sitting on a loading dock at Qantas. God, that's Australia. At Delta in Atlanta.
Yeah, but the thing about it is, ladies and gentlemen, develop your what we affectionately call it. Develop your dumbbell. Or if you want to do more than that, don't go no more than a tri-haul. Find you 2 major markets that you can run back and forth between, and service the hell out of the customers that you can acquire within that dumbbell. I call it a dumbbell because you got 2 markets in the line in between. It kind of looks like a dumbbell. But if you can get a tri-haul and any of that type of stuff. There's sometimes a tri-haul, if you're in the right markets, can be just a thing that the doctor ordered. For smaller carriers, I always say that the dumbbell probably is the smarter option, because the one thing that you can't be when you're that small is you can't be all things to all people. But if you are religiously in that market on a regular basis, then you got something that the big boys don't have, and that's being able to be nimble and being able to service between those two. You can guarantee service between those two particular markets on a next day basis. That
Exactly.
I think that's a great niche that can be had, whether it's
Mm.
dry van, flatbed, or reefer. Just
Man.
depends on what part of the country that you're in.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good at marketing. You got to be good at marketing too, right? So you've got to, again, get out of your comfort zone, because it's not easy to pick up the phone and call people that you maybe don't know. Call by people that are a shipper and say, "Hey, can I haul your freight?" You're out of your comfort zone for a lot of folks. But
Even
that's
the
where you,
brokers, though, we've talked about this. Even the brokers, they don't want to, and no offense, Dean, to you and DAT, but they don't want to post stuff on the board. They'd rather know, well, hell,
right?
I'm phoning Rico because he's in Atlanta
Exactly.
every second
Yep.
day.
Exactly.
Yep.
They'd feel a
Yep.
lot better doing that, other
Yeah.
than, because don't forget, when they post stuff on a load board, they risk, first of all, they've got to vet a new carrier. Now, I
Right.
can tell you from running a brokerage for decades, in today's money, it costs a minimum of $100 to
To
vet
load.
and put a
All
new
right.
carrier in the
Right.
system.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Wouldn't I rather phone Dean or
Yep.
phone Rico and say, hey, you want this load? Because I
Right.
know you run it. But you know what?
Yep.
If you tell me that you run from Boston to Chicago, and I phone you and I go, well, I've got a load out of Boston. You go, well,
Right.
that doesn't work for me, Chuck, because
Yeah.
you know what? I'm in California this week. I'm never calling you again.
Never.
I'll tell you that. You're
Right.
off.
Exactly. Yeah.
Not that it's just, I'm not going to waste my time making phone calls unless I'm
Yeah.
really desperate and nobody lights up from DAT.
Right.
And I'm no different than any of the other hundreds of thousands of people that make those
Mm.
calls.
Mm. Well, your
That's why,
network is key, right? So as a broker, you
yes,
need a
be
strong network.
famous for something,
Yeah.
boys and girls.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like if you wanted a steak dinner, you would not go to McDonald's. Okay,
Right.
if you wanted a hamburger, you would. It's the same thing. Why do
Right.
why do people go to Starbucks? They go because they want a cup of coffee. Okay,
Right. Right.
that's what Starbucks does. You don't go there for a shrimp cocktail. Well, it's the same thing. This is trucking is more than loading up a wagon or a deck
Mm.
and letting the brakes off and going down the road. That's the
Mm.
smallest part of it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right. Well, I'm looking at the time, Dean. We coming up on that time. It goes by really quickly when we have you up and on
Especially
board.
with you, yeah.
Sounds good, man.
I'd like to give you an opportunity, Dean, to maybe tell the good folks on where they can find you and see your work and all that type of stuff. Where we can keep up
Yeah.
with you. We know
Hey,
you're
yeah.
kind of active on Instagram as the Grumpy Pete over there on Instagram.
Yep. Yep.
Great
Yep.
post as always over there. But besides that, what else you got for us?
Yeah, I'm in charge of pumping up everyone's tires, making everyone feel good about what they do. So that's my job in my part time, but full time as a market analyst. I do a weekly blog post. I think it's a really insightful way. It's kind of an unbiased look at the freight market. If you go to dat.com/market update, you can see my blog post each week. And I do a quick summary of load to truck ratio and spot rates in both dry van, reefer, and flatbed markets each week, and put some charts in there that are free. If you download that report, you can get a copy of where rates are relative to the last 4 or 5 years in a fairly easy to consume charts. This week, the blog post is on the sleep epidemic that's affecting teenagers and truckers in particular.
Right.
One of the hardest things for truckers to deal with is problems at home. That's where a lot of problems come from, is at home. It's very hard to deal with as a driver. Sleep is at the heart of a lot of our challenges. So it's one of my specialties. It's a passion of mine. I've spent a lot of time teaching the science of sleep. So I've got a couple of weeks of blog posts on sleep, how to get good quality sleep, scheduling. And of course, next week, we're talking about drowsy driving week and the end of daylight saving, which means higher accident risk and less daylight. So now's a good time to be thinking about sleep. If you go to dat.com/market update, you'll be able to download that PDF file and get yourself educated.
Well, we got a little bit of more time, Dean. I'm looking at it. We got a little bit more time. You care to go into that a little bit? I meant to brought that up a little early in the show, but then we got off on a tangent. Because I got a chance to read it was really interesting in what you was talking about there with suffering from a sleep sleep deficit.
Yeah. It's the average teenager develops a sleep debt of about 20 hours by the time Saturday morning gets round. And a sleep debt is the difference between what you need and what you get. If you need 8 and get 5, you've got a debt of 3. And it's cumulative. So, if Monday you got a debt of 3, it's 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, right? So, and that's why teenagers need to have a sleep marathon on weekends to pay back the sleep debt. And the human brain is wired such that you need at least 2 periods of night sleep back to back to dispense the sleep debt. If you've got a 15-hour sleep debt, you don't need 15 extra hours. You just need 2 periods of night sleep. The brain is incredibly capable, resilient, efficient at dispensing a sleep debt with 2 nights sleep. That's why the FMCSA had the 34-hour restart spanning 2 periods of night, 1 to 5 a.m. And the industry pushed back on that incorrectly, saying it was about safety. It wasn't. It was about productivity. But if you have a 34-hour restart and you don't get 2 periods of night sleep, what happens is if you've got a 15-hour debt and you only get rid of, say, 5 of it, 10 hours carries over Monday. And if you do that every single week, it's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. And the next thing, you're dragging your sorry butt in and out of truck stops and rest areas. You feel tired, your head aches. There's a dull ache behind your eyes. It's called fatigue, and it's cumulative. And that's why you need 2 periods of night sleep. So I start with teenagers because a lot of folks in the trucking industry have teenagers. There's a sleep epidemic with teenagers right now. In puberty, they become night owls. During puberty, their body clock shifts 3 hours. If they went to bed at 9, it's now midnight. They've still got to get up at 6 a.m. And if they need 10 hours of sleep and they get 6, they got a debt of 4 every single day. And what parents do, like my father did, they woke me every Saturday morning because they thought I was lazy. What I really needed was a sleep in. I needed a sleep marathon. So my message in closing to everybody is never wake a sleeping teenager. Never. Your life will be a whole lot better if you let them sleep at all.
That is
so that basically kind of shoots that, a lot of people feel like, well, man, I don't need but 2.5, 3 hours of sleep, and
that's rubbish.
I can jump right back in the saddle and go.
No, you can't. Not for long. Maybe one night.
You know what? And you hear these. I think Donald Trump was one of them that went on saying that he only needed 3 hours a night sleep. And then people want to be like him, so they want to function on 3 hours a night sleep. And let me tell you, from somebody that has done it, you become more impaired from lack of sleep than you do from booze.
Right. Well, so we did the first study when I was running the ATA in Australia in 1997. We did the very first study on comparing alcohol impairment to driving. We had 2 groups of students at Adelaide University. Half of them, we fed them alcohol every 30 minutes. The other half we kept awake. 16 hours of sustained wakefulness is the same as 0.05.
Really?
20 hours of sustained wakefulness is 0.10. Now, you ask yourself, how many truckers are out there today that have been awake for 16 hours? They're compliant with hours of service.
Right.
16 hours awake, you're driving or working at 0.05 blood alcohol impairment. That's a solid study that's been repeated year after year after year. We've kind of managed the wrong thing. We manage hours of work is incorrect. It should be there how many hours you're awake, because that's what really determines performance impairment. So I think that, again, this is something I cover in next week's blog post. There's a lot to talk about here. Love to come back on and talk about this.
Yes, I was just thinking, I'd love to have you on and talk about sleep, because it's really the backbone of our safety.
Yeah. I've taught sleep classes for truckers. I've done nearly 600 sleep classes for truckers over the time, because I lost a couple of drivers who were sound asleep at the wheel yet compliant with their logs and killed themselves. I have spent years trying to save drivers' lives by teaching them about sleep, and more importantly, teaching them about what a micro sleep is. The head nod is the wake up, not the sleep. You've already been asleep for 5 seconds if your head's nodded, because those neck muscles take about 5 seconds to relax and collapse. So teaching them about sleep and scheduling and getting the parents involved and teaching drivers how to nap and how to set your alarm clock. We should do this one night, because it's one of the most important things I've ever done in my career, is teaching drivers how to sleep, because I used to fall asleep at the wheel for a living. And I joke about this, but the reality is there's nothing to hit in Australia when you run off the road. And I'm only here because of sheer luck. I used to fall asleep half a dozen times a night. Half a dozen times a night, I'd be off the road. And I'm only here because of just sheer luck. But I've got, the guy that's on the back of my fifth wheel cover as a custom memorial, he wasn't so lucky. So every now and then, people make mistakes. A lot of times you don't know that you're sound asleep at the wheel. You'll travel about 300, 400 feet with your eyes closed before your head nods. Yeah. But
right.
Talking to drivers about fatigue is not the answer. You've got to talk to them about sleep, how to get good quality sleep. So when you get behind the wheel, you give yourself the best possible chance of survival, because it's really hard to stay awake at 4 and 5 in the morning when you're hauling freight, even if you've got plenty of hours. Yeah. Right,
all right, Dean, if you got a couple more minutes, we'll try to airborne trucker one more time before we get out of here, see if he has a question for us. We're gonna give him a shot one more time. Let's see.
Here he goes.
All right. I had to get on a whole nother computer.
There you go. Okay.
How you doing, bro? How you doing, Rico? Man, I hadn't talked to you in a good little while, man. But I'm excited about seeing how you definitely, I've seen over the years the steps, and so hey, I'm still around here. Okay. I'm still in Memphis. So and it's good to meet your host here. As your co-host here as well, Chuck. I really, really enjoy y'all guys and the information you put out, because, like I said, a lot of the owner operators definitely do need it, and it keeps me sharp on my side too as well, to keep up to date with the industry and things like, and I try to educate a lot of my other truck driving family about it. And I wish more of them would actually take the time out and watch, because like you say, they're doing the rates a lot of time wrong way. Right. They're doing it based off of the bills that they have to pay, not understanding the market, and then also understanding the demand. And a lot of times they don't get enough information, about the load, and so they're just just throwing out numbers and not really understanding the numbers that they need in order to just make sure that they are running at board. You know what I'm saying? A lot of times they're doing it less than, and then the risk, you think about it, we are in one of the most dangerous job in the world.
Right up there.
Yeah. And and so the thing is that a lot of times we just take a lot of stuff for granted. And so I'm trying to educate them and say, hey, look, we got to do better. Because the thing about it is, I know a lot of us is in the truck, and we're taking care of more than just our family. We're taking extended family members, stuff like that, and we're helping to pay bills when they need to save their house.
Right. You got a question for us before we?
Yeah, I do have a question. I want to say, wrap it up. Okay, I just want to quickly just ask, how do you see the flatbed market with a lot of the infrastructure, like you talked about, being built? So that's what I wanted. Just can you?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we're going to see more infrastructure projects come online. So that means more plate steel, more. There's probably going to be more aggregate. More blue met, like more asphalt, more gravel, more concrete than plate steel. There'll be a lot of products. Like steel railings along the side of the interstates. So I think there'll be good demand for flatbed carriers in that area. There's certain markets where there's good demand for flatbed carriers always. Like we talked earlier on the show about Houston, a lot of good break bulk volume coming in there. A lot of steel is coming in from overseas. So I think some of those import markets I'd keep my eye on. For flatbed carriers, I would be watching in particular Baltimore, Philadelphia markets, and Houston. San Diego is always a good market for coil steel. There's a lot of break bulk comes in those ships into the San Diego port, so you're always seeing pretty good rates out of there. Flatbed market seems to always pretty buoyant in Los Angeles, but as always, Portland, Medford, Seattle are always really strong flatbed markets, because that's where a lot of softwood lumber comes from. Likewise, Maine, Vermont, and if you can run cross-border into Quebec, a lot of good volumes come out of there.
And one thing I want to add, are the rates, since the rates have doubled in the Home Depots and the Lowe's for lumber, are the rates going up with the lumber? Because the lumber used to be one of the cheapest things. Everybody want to throw it
Right. I only wish that the rates we got to haul lumber were the same as the price that it's costing me to renovate my house. Man, am I getting ripped a new one right there? That's awful. So, but I think it's supply and demand. We've had a lot more carriers enter this industry in the last year than we've ever seen. So there's too many carriers, and of course, flatbed, you can haul almost anything on a flatbed. Step decks are a little bit different, so you're kind of the lowest common denominator when it comes to hauling freight. So you've got to be very careful about what lanes you run. We're seeing pretty good volumes in Houston, like anything to do with drilling. So drill pipe casing, those sorts of markets, energy markets like Houston in particular, Dallas, Fort Worth, pretty good markets for flatbed carriers. But as always with flatbed, as you know, you've got a lot of accessorial costs you've got to add into it, time under crane, tarping costs, chain costs, crane unloading, loading. You got a lot of downtime. So you got to be even more careful about your operating costs in flatbed, because it's not just about the load and the miles. It's about what you've got to do either end to get it off.
Right.
It takes as much time to tarp a load that's going from Boston to Albany as it does from Boston to California. It takes the same amount of time, and people need to remember that.
Yeah. I think the key is cost control right now. I think you got to be very careful on your costs, right? There'll be opportunities in certain markets. Got to be study the markets. Listen to our show, listen to what markets are hot, what markets are cold, and then figure out what your best strategy is. But understanding your operating costs are absolutely critical, because I think, expanding on your point a little bit earlier, a lot of operators focus on rate per mile, which I think is the starting point. You've got to think about revenue per day. Right, because your time constraint now, since ELDs came in, is time. You've only got a certain amount of time each day to bang out that $1,500, and you've got the best way you can get that sort of revenue per day is probably the most important thing to focus on, because then the rate per mile becomes a secondary part of that. I would like to say to any broker, hey, you get me $1,500 a day, I'll run anywhere. But I'm not going to sit on a 600-mile load for 2 days at $2 a mile. I'm not going to do that. But that's how I think a lot of carriers miss the point, because they're not thinking about fixed and variable costs and what it costs them every single day. It probably costs somewhere between $200 and $300 a day just to sit a truck, not run a mile, but just to sit. So I think revenue per day is the thing that we probably should cover a little bit more on this show. But that's sort of where I'd be thinking right now is, how do I get revenue per day and make sure my costs are pretty tight.
Yeah, we might have to have a breakdown on that. Go back over the cost.
Yeah,
Airborne Trucker, we appreciate you for your questions.
Thanks
you. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. I love it.
Bless, be safe out there.
All right. So, Dean, you already told us where we can find you. Chuck, let the people know where they can find you.
If anybody needs any help, please just reach out to me. Best on email, just chuck@traffix, TRAFFIX.com, and give me your phone number, include it in your email, and I will call or email you back. And with that, Rico, I'll let you back it in this hole for another week.
Yes, sir. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we want to thank you guys, our listeners, whether you're listening live or if you're watching this later on a video recording later on down the road. We appreciate you for taking time out to spend a little time with us. We're always grateful that you did so. You could have been anywhere else in the world, but you took a little time to hang out with us. We're always eternally grateful for you doing so. With that being said, we want you guys to stay safe out there, stay healthy, keep it in between the mustard and the mayonnaise, and God willing, we'll talk at you same time, same place next week. God bless you and good night.
Catch you on the flip-flop. God bless. Thanks, Dean.